What is at stake for the Louisville Cardinals in week 3 against the Indiana Hoosiers? We will answer that question and more on today's episode of the Locked On Louisville podcast. Stay tuned.
You are Locked On Louisville, your daily podcast on the Louisville Cardinals. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey, what's going on, everyone? Welcome into another episode of the Locked On Louisville podcast. I'm your host, Dalton Pence. Today's episode brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off of your first purchase. As always, I'm your host, Dalton Pence. I want to thank you all again for making Locked On Louisville your first listen of the day. Just a reminder that the show is free on all streaming services, 5 days a week, your team every day. We are diving into previewing the upcoming football matchup for the Louisville Cardinals in week 3 against the Indiana Hoosiers. That game will be at noon on Saturday at Lucas Oil Stadium against the Hoosiers. We'll talk about what's at stake for the Cardinals. We'll also talk about IU canceling the series after this upcoming season. Who could be some teams that could be added to the schedule? Who would you like to see added in a hypothetical sense? So on and so forth. And then to conclude the show, we will identify the players to watch for the Louisville Cardinals. One offensive player, one defensive player. So this is a pretty interesting matchup because we don't see Louisville and Indiana square off often in most sports. But when they do, it seems like it's always a pretty solid matchup. And there hasn't been one time in my lifetime that Louisville has played against Indiana in football. So this is some uncharted territory. So what's at stake for the Cardinals in this matchup? For those that are pretty new to following the show, one thing that I like to do before each matchup with a certain team on the schedule, especially to kick off the preview, is to talk about what is at stake for Louisville in this matchup, not only for the respective opponent, but also in the context of where they are in the season. So Louisville's sitting at 2-0, first time since 2017 that they've accomplished that feat. They have defeated Georgia Tech by 5, and they also beat Murray State by 56. They now will square off against an Indiana team that is 1-1 on the season. They lost that opening game to Ohio State, where they really struggled offensively. Only put up 3 points against the Buckeyes. But whether you want to contribute it to poor quarterback play for the Buckeyes or solid defensive play from the Hoosiers, I think you could probably argue that it is a little bit of both. But Indiana held Ohio State to 23, ended up losing that game nonetheless. And then the second game of the schedule, last Friday evening, they played and defeated Indiana State 41-7. The Sycamores are 0-2 after getting blanked to Eastern Illinois and obviously blown out to Indiana. So Indiana comes into this game sort of in a weird spot because you can say they have momentum, and that's fine to suggest that, but sort of like for Louisville, I don't put too much stock into beating teams that you're supposed to beat and beating them pretty handedly. The line for this game, as it currently sits, is Louisville minus 10. I think it opened up as Louisville minus 10.5. So at least Vegas believes that this is a game that the Cardinals should probably win somewhat comfortably. Indiana does have some question marks, most notably being the quarterback position. 2 quarterbacks for Indiana have played this season. It started out with Brendan Sorsby, and then Taven Jackson, the Tennessee transfer, took over. He was named the starting quarterback on Monday. So Jackson is a player that we talked about in the preview leading up to the season when we briefly talked about the opposition that Louisville will be facing this year. Jackson was pretty highly rated coming out of high school. He is an Indiana native from Greenwood, and he is also a player that didn't necessarily get a ton of time at Tennessee whatsoever. Didn't even really play much at all, completed 3 passes of 4 attempts, but that's the main thing for Indiana is figuring out to make sure that they have the right player at quarterback. But for Louisville at stake in this game, I think that it's going to be the same for the first portion of the schedule, the first 4 games specifically, and that is handling business. That's sort of the mantra that we've continued to address is you're supposed to win these first 4 games. So at the end of the day, you have to go out and do it. And you can argue as to how much there is to gain from a game like this and how much there is to lose. And what's very clear, unfortunately, and this just comes with the territory, that the Cardinals and any team that's favored don't really have much more to gain as much as they do to lose when you are favored in a game. Now, granted, I think Indiana is a respectable team that if you're not careful and if you don't play up to the level that which we know you can play, you could have a situation like Georgia Tech where you're down double digits going into halftime, and then you're like, oh crap, let's wake up, let's play better, and then Louisville ends up allowing one touchdown in the final half of football against Georgia Tech, and it was at the very end when the Cardinals were playing prevent defense, and they essentially dominated the second half. But we see, I think I look at Georgia Tech sort of in the same light that I do Indiana. Indiana's in a little bit of a different spot program-wise. They're trying to figure out how to sort of replicate that success they had just a couple years ago. You have Tom Allen, who past couple years, it hasn't been smooth sailing for the Hoosiers. They've lost a ton of conference games. They've finished with under 5 wins the past 2 years, and it's a matter of trying to build that success this season. They have some solid pieces on offense and on defense. I just truthfully think that Louisville is the better team on paper. Now, granted, you have to win this game. From talking to some Indiana fans, they truly believe that the Cardinals are going to bring more fans to Lucas Oil Stadium than the Hoosiers will. So on the field, what's at stake is continuing to increase that momentum, continuing to win the games that you were supposed to win, and most importantly, continuing to handle business. So what's at stake here? Not much to gain, but also, if you want to flip the argument on its head and talk about, well, what is there to lose? What is at stake if you were to lose this game? Well, obviously, a game in which you are favored by double digits, losing that game, it's hard to spin that positively at all. I'm not really sure that you can. So there's that. But also, I think it's an optic look as well. I think Louisville fans, if you were to ask them, Indiana is not necessarily a team that we view as rivals, but it's still a local battle, and it means a little bit more considering that it is somewhat local. So you obviously want to win those games. And there's a little bit of a sour taste in Louisville fans' mouths with Indiana now backing out of this series after this year. And we'll talk about that in the next segment. But what is at stake here on the field? Well, not much to gain, but the opportunity to handle business, to continue that momentum moving forward, and also to ensure that you don't slip up in the first portion of the schedule. And I think this is where it gets a little bit tricky because you look at the stretch of next 2 games between Indiana and Boston College. And it's like, okay, Louisville should win these games pretty handedly. Well, we saw in Georgia Tech how when you don't play up to the level we know you can play, that games are a lot closer than you desire them to be. So I think for Indiana, for this game's sake, it's a matter of continuing to improve for Louisville. I think a win here against Indiana would continue their overall favor across the country in terms of AP polls, overall thoughts on the program. Look, a lot of people have talked about the Cardinals program in this team specifically as a potential dark horse in the conference, and you really start to lose credibility if you were to lose this game against Indiana, just from an optics level. And then obviously beating Indiana, I feel like just means more than beating a regular team, considering the local battle between the two. There is some history between Jeff Brom and the Hoosiers program, obviously with him being the coach at Purdue and having played Indiana, a name that Indiana fans know well. He recruits well in the state as well. So overall, what's at stake here? Same thing that's been at stake over the past 2 weeks. You put your momentum on the line. You win this game. It's another win, which is great. But if you were to lose the game, you lose that momentum. You lose a good amount of steam heading into the middle portion of the schedule with some solid matchups against NC State, with Notre Dame, so on and so forth. But that's what's at stake versus Indiana. Unfortunately for Louisville and those who are looking forward to this matchup for years to come, there won't be much to watch for after Saturday. Indiana has decided to cancel the series, according to reports, after this year, foregoing the next two matchups in the series with the Cardinals. We'll talk about why that is, what came about, and how Louisville will now look to fill that spot here momentarily after we talk about our friends over at Gametime. Look, if you are looking to go to the game on Saturday, Lucas Oil Stadium, fantastic venue. If you're looking to go to the game, look no further than using Gametime for your tickets. Getting last-minute tickets can be a hassle, but Gametime has flash deals and ticket opportunities that are easy to find and buy for every kind of event, not just only football or sports, but concerts, theater, comedy, etc. They have a lowest price guaranteed. So essentially what that means is that you'll always get the best price. If you find tickets in the same section and row for less, Gametime will credit you 110% of the difference. So snag those tickets without the stress with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, use the code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off. Download Gametime today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. Hey, Cardinal fans, obviously the college football season is young, but the season this upcoming year, Locked On, will be kicking off our coverage with Locked On College Football Kickoff Live. Each Friday, the network will go live from 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. Eastern on every Locked On College YouTube channel. College Football Kickoff Live will cover playoff implications, the conference rivalry games, and go in-depth like only Locked On can, including insight and analysis from our stable of Locked On College hosts covering their team every day. Find Locked On College Football Kickoff Live every Friday from 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. Eastern Time on any Locked On College YouTube channel. You won't want to miss it, so be sure to stay tuned. Okay, heading into the second segment of the show, we just talked about what's at stake for the Louisville Cardinals in the Week 3 matchup with the Indiana Hoosiers. I said that this is a matchup between two teams that I wish would play more often. Unfortunately, it was announced on Monday evening that Indiana would be foregoing the final two matchups in this series, both the home and home for Louisville and Indiana, while paying Louisville around $1 million to do so. According to many Indiana fans and even national media, it seems like this is something that possibly was in the works for quite some time. With all of the conference realignment, it makes sense for Louisville, or it makes sense for Indiana to look to get a little bit easier of a non-conference schedule with how the Big Ten is shaping up to be, adding Oregon, adding some solid teams. So looking at their schedule right now, I mean, their non-conference schedule, they have Florida Atlantic. They had Louisville on the road, but not any longer. Charlotte is also in the mix there. And with the new scheduling model for the Big Ten, they have more conference games. They have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, obviously adding UCLA, adding Oregon to the mix, and the conference realignment has just made everything kind of challenging. So on one hand, I get it. if you add an easier opponent to the schedule, you essentially get a better chance at becoming bowl eligible. You almost guarantee yourself a win if you handle business. But as a Louisville fan, I'm sitting here like, really? Are we serious now? Which, I mean, I get it. I mean, Indiana was trying to back out of this game back in the summer. But it just makes me a little angry. It kind of ticks me off a little bit because I'm like, are we really ducking the Louisville Cardinals because you aren't confident that you're going to win conference games? It is what it is. Indiana has the ability to do what they wish. Thanks for the $1 million to put towards whatever Louisville wants to put it towards. Now the Cardinals will look for a new opponent next season. Granted, this is where things get a little bit tricky. There's been talks that the ACC just doesn't want teams to schedule two FCS teams, and Louisville does have Austin Peay already on the schedule for next year. So you would imagine that Louisville would probably not add a FCS team, and it seems like there's been talks that the ACC doesn't want their teams to schedule home and homes with Power 5 teams. I'm not sure the validity of those statements, but as of right now, the non-conference is Austin Peay at Notre Dame and at Kentucky. So you have a solid slate of non-conference games. Clemson also on the schedule for next year, along with North Carolina. So schedule's a little bit harder than it is this season, at least on paper. So, there's a lot of different ways to look at this. Right now, there's not a lot of teams with a ton of openings on their schedule. Some teams that I've heard that potentially have openings, TCU, UConn, Army, and then some other group of 5 level teams, FCS teams as well. So I guess worst case scenario, you could go with an FCS team if need be. You also could go with one of those teams. I think that having a home and home or even a neutral site game against TCU, maybe in Houston or somewhere else, I mean, that would be a huge matchup. I think that would be a very intriguing matchup as well against a team that you don't see Louisville play against a ton, or actually probably ever in my lifetime. And then UConn, Big East opponent of the past. I think it would make sense. I think it's a game that Louisville would probably go into favored, but I'm all for bringing that back. And then Army playing an Armed Forces Academy team, I think would obviously be kind of neat as well. But it'll be interesting to see how Louisville fills the schedule. And then if you want to play the hypothetical game, I mean, you could say that teams have the flexibility to get out of some games that they're already in and schedule Louisville. I think the group of teams that I would love to see Louisville go after and try to play are the old Big East opponents that aren't in the ACC. I mean, you're talking about South Florida. You're talking about West Virginia, Cincinnati. Obviously, there's a ton of reasons as to why they should schedule Cincinnati. Memphis is another team that I think, the long historical rivalry there. And then we mentioned UConn as well. I think that would make a lot of sense. You could also try to schedule a Power 5 team at a neutral site, potentially a ranked team, as we've seen Louisville do. I'm not sure how good of a decision that would be with how tough the schedule could be next year, top-heavy wise. I mean, you have UNC, Clemson, Notre Dame, and Kentucky. I think all 4 of those games will be pretty tough for the Cardinals. And then you have Miami as well, which could also be pretty solid. But it'll be interesting, that game for Indiana, at least as, from what I understand, it's going to be on September 7th. So they'll open the season up against Austin Peay, and then they will square off with whoever they have in week 2, or whoever they will add in week 2, I should say. So that's kind of interesting here. I think that there's a lot of different ways you could go. I'm pretty aggravated that Indiana has canceled this. I'm like, okay, are we really serious here? I get it from a Hoosier standpoint, but I still would like to see this matchup. I'd like to go play in Bloomington and, just continue this to try to create a rivalry. But hey, if Indiana wants to cancel it, best of luck to them. We move on and we try to find who the next opponent will be, and we'll talk about who that opponent will be whenever that gets announced, whether it's going to be a 1-year schedule or maybe a multiple year commitment. That's something to be seen. You would assume that there's a possibility for a home and home with that slate open through 2025 for Louisville. So just something to focus on here, a lot of different ways that you could go. But back to the matchup in general, we're going to continue to preview it in the next segment, talking about the two key players to watch for Louisville, one offensively, one defensively, and why I believe them to be players to watch for. We'll do that here momentarily. Before we do that, I want to thank you all again for making Locked On Louisville your first listen of the day. Just a reminder that the podcast is free on all streaming services, 5 days a week, your team every day. There's two key players to watch for, in my opinion, for the Louisville Cardinals. Obviously, you could go with a handful of players for this overall debate, but I'm going to go one offensively, one defensively. Offensively, I'm going to go with the rushing carries leader for Louisville. That is Isaac Guerendo. He leads the Cardinals with 17 carries, 90 yards on the season, averaging 5.3 yards per carry. He has played in both games, had 6 carries against Georgia Tech, had 11 against Murray State, found the end zone in that game against Murray State. 6'1" senior from Clayton, Indiana, from Wisconsin, played at Wisconsin. Obviously, he is playing a Big Ten opponent that he is familiar with, but that's not the reason why he's the key offensive player to watch for me in this game, because I think specifically we talk about Jawar Jordan and how great he is. I think Maurice Turner is a running back that has a similar skill set to Jawar Jordan. I think that Jordan's going to get his opportunities, but I think that this is a game to where I'm interested to see how Isaac Guerendo is able to try to wear down this Indiana defense. I think it's up in the air as to whether or not that this is a solid unit. I mean, they held Ohio State to 23. Ohio State had some quarterback issues. They held Indiana State to less than 10 points. Indiana State's not a good team. So I think that this will be another solid test for the Indiana defense. So we'll see just how this goes for the Louisville rushing attack. It seems like that has been of the utmost importance for Louisville, trying to establish the run. They've been able to do so. And I think that Guerendo is going to get a solid amount of work in this game against the Hoosiers on Saturday, because he has shown the ability to wear defenses down, very efficient rushing for over 5 yards per carry. And that doesn't really incorporate a large run. I mean, his longest run of the season was 25 yards. So 17 carries for 90 yards. He's been able to be pretty solid. He also has 5 catches for 60 yards in the young season. Last year, he had 17 catches for 115 yards. So it's very obvious that he's becoming more involved in the passing game. And I think that that is going to be very valuable for Jack Plummer to have a security blanket in the backfield, to have as, a receiver. And that's something that I look forward to watching. I think that he is going to have a solid game. I think that he is a player that I have a feeling that he's going to have a big time play or set of plays in this game that's really going to help the Louisville offense. So that's something to focus on here. Isaac Guerendo is my offensive player to watch for the Louisville Cardinals. Defensively, I looked at a couple different players to recognize for this for this debate. But for me, I went with Devin Neal. Neal is leading, or he's second on the team in tackles with 9. He has a pass deflection and an interception along with a fumble recovery. Josh Minkins, his status is still up in the air as of when this podcast was recorded on Tuesday evening. And add that to the injury that MJ Griffin had, and Louisville could be without 2 of their starting preseason safeties in this matchup against Indiana. So if Minkins isn't available, or even if he is, but he's on a snap count or he's not playing a ton, I think that this is a game where we need Devin Neal to continue to play well. This past game, he had 5 tackles, which was a season high, but he also recovered a fumble and intercepted a pass along with having a pass deflection. So he was involved everywhere. The 6-foot native of Lexington spent a couple years with the Baylor Bears, 3 to be exact, had a very solid season last year. But I look for him to continue to find his form. I think that he is the defensive player to watch for me because of the responsibility that he's likely going to fill. I think he is going to be one of the starting safeties for the Cardinals, regardless if Josh Minkins plays or not. If Minkins doesn't play, the responsibility grows even more for not only him, but Cam Kelly as well, the UNC transfer. But even if he does play, I think that you're going to see Devin Neal being a player that they rely upon a ton in the back half of the secondary to help out the Cardinals defense. So he's the defensive player to watch for me. We're going to continue to preview this matchup on the Thursday episode of the show. We have a Locked On podcast crossover episode with the Locked On Hoosiers host Jacob Rude. So be sure to stay tuned into that. But to find the Locked On Louisville podcast on all platforms and streaming services, be sure to utilize this graphic, free and available wherever you get your podcasts.